I'm Sam Temple. Today, you're watching a counterpart to our longer, more comprehensive biography of James Shields.
I'm Logan Ledman. One of the stories we found while telling the James Shields story was so full of compelling and surprising details, we have to flesh it out into a video of its own.
This is that story. A story of divided loyalties, of the brutalities of warfare, the shocking coincidences of American history. It's the story of how James Shields, an icon of Irish American history, found himself responsible for capturing and killing his fellow Irishmen. And it's a story of why those Irishmen deserted the United States Army and took up arms against their new home.
James Shields was born in 1806 in Ireland. After a wild overseas voyage to the United States as a young man, James Shields established himself as a talented Midwest lawyer. But he had a quick temper and a capacity for making enemies, such as fellow Illinois lawyer Abraham Lincoln, with whom he came moments away from fighting in a duel.
The Black Hawk War in 1832 was Shields' first experience with war. It would not be his last. Throughout his time in military service, Shields proved himself to be an exceptionally adept commander, eventually fighting in both the Mexican-American and United States Civil War, to general acclaim in both.
Today's story is about Shields' time in the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War is criminally underlooked in American popular memory, but it literally reshaped America. The story began in 1836, when a northern region of Mexico, overtaken largely by American slave owners illegally occupying the land, declared itself the independent Republic of Texas. It was annexed as a U.S. state in 1846.
Slavery was both the dominant controversy of America at the time and the fuel of the economic engine turning the United States into a regional superpower. What the system of slave labor camps required most, however, was land.
President James Polk had won election by promising to get as much land as he could, and the lands stretching from Texas to the west coast, which belonged to Mexico, presented a perfect opportunity. Polk declared that the Texas border extended deep into Mexico, to the Rio Grande, 150 miles south of the generally accepted border. He ordered a detachment of troops to march to the Rio Grande.
It was pretty clear to many what was happening, including the men who were ordered south. Colonel Ethan Hitchcock wrote in his diary, quote, "The United States are the aggressors. We have not one particle of right to be here. It looks as if the government sent a small force on purpose to bring on a war so as to have a pretext for taking California and as much of this country as it chooses." End quote. Hitchcock was right. The U.S. provocation caused a skirmish where 16 soldiers were killed. It was the pretext Polk was looking for. In a perversely upside-down message to Congress, President Polk claimed that, quote, "War exists, notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it. Exists by the act of Mexico herself." End quote.
The declaration of war was rushed through Congress, and only a single half hour of debate was allowed. The Mexican-American War began. A vast coalition of American military officers were sent south to take the land, fighting against Mexico. Among the Mexican defenders was most famously a legendary Mexican leader, Santa Anna. After a year of fighting, by August 20th, 1847, the U.S. Army had already beaten back Santa Anna's men at the Battle of Contreras, and General Winfield Scott's 8,000-strong force pursued the 4,000-strong Mexican forces northeast to the town of Churubusco, south of Mexico City.
Defending Mexico City was a major priority for the Mexican forces. Santa Anna and his men hastily prepared defenses in a convent in the center of town and at a bridge over the Rio Churubusco, as Winfield Scott quickly, quote, reconnoitered and planned an attack. Did I say reconnoitered? Reconnoitered?
Scott decided on a three-pronged defense. One prong would march straight to the convent and attempt to breach the walls. One would attack the bridge from the south. The last prong would cross the Rio Churubusco, attempt to flank the Mexicans, and attack the bridge from the north.
As the troops moved into position, Scott made a last-minute change, adding reinforcements to the last prong. Brigadier General James Shields, in charge of the New York and South Carolina volunteer regiments, was sent to reinforce an inexperienced officer leading the northbound force. This was Shields' very first day back on combat duty, after 9 debilitating weeks healing from a near-lethal lung wound.
At the Battle of Cerro Gordo, a bullet had gone through his chest. It should have been a fatal wound, but a prisoner of war from the Mexican army working as a surgeon had an ingenious idea to save General Shields. The surgeon took a ramrod from a rifle, a long, thin metal cylinder used to ram cartridges down the gun's barrel. He wrapped the end of the ramrod in a handkerchief and plunged it into the general's body, thus halting excess bleeding. Miraculously, Shields survived.
6 weeks later, Shields was ready to take over for the young man he reinforced back at Churubusco, a less experienced general and future president named Franklin Pierce. Instead of attacking the bridge, Shields realized that if they got to the northern highway, they could cut off the only escape route for the Mexicans in Churubusco. Together, they advanced across the river, through a thick cornfield, to the highway behind the convent and bridge, where thousands of Mexican soldiers were waiting, preparing to reinforce their men in town. Realizing his predicament, Shields sent a messenger for reinforcements, 40-year-old Captain Robert E. Lee, who rushed back to Winfield Scott with the request.
Many of the men who fought together in 1847 would meet again on opposite sides during the Civil War. Future Confederate Generals James Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson and future Confederate President Jefferson Davis all fought in Mexico. Union Generals Ulysses S. Grant, William Sherman, and George McClellan did too. When General Scott sent Shields some backup cavalry, both were future Confederate generals.
As the reinforcements rushed to them, Shields, Pierce, and their troops took cover in an abandoned estate next to the highway and engaged the men on the road, stopping them from reinforcing their men in town. Artillery regiments peeked out of the walls of the estate, blasting the Mexican infantry into confusion. But it was a vastly one-sided fight, and the Mexicans were laying down a terrific barrage of fire against the U.S. soldiers and getting ready to head into town.
General Shields decided to push. He formed up his South Carolina men into a central core of an offensive line, and assisted by the New York Regiment and Pierce's men, they charged to the highway. The results were devastating. Of the 272 men in Shields' South Carolina Regiment, 137 died in the charge, a full half of the men. The survivors made it to the road.
It should have been, and would have been under any other circumstance, a total disaster for the United States. But in town, unassisted by their distracted highway reserves, the Mexican troops had lost control of the bridge, and the convent walls were breached. Just as Shields' barge began, retreating Mexican troops started pouring down the highway, pursued by the United States. By the time Shields and his bloody men reached the road, the Mexican troops were in full panic and streaming north. The U.S. troops under Shields' command set up cannons and fired at will at the retreating men. The cavalry, including officers and potentially Shields himself, charged after the fleeing soldiers, cutting them down with sabers.
Shields took 800 prisoners as the Battle of Churubusco ended. Some of the prisoners, and the men that Shields cut down or watched be cut down on August 20th, 1847, probably struck James as familiar.
The St. Patrick's Battalion, or in Spanish the Battalion de San Patricio, was a decorated unit of the Mexican Army in 1846 and 1847, primarily composed of hundreds of Irish immigrants who deserted the U.S. Army to defend Mexico. Although it was mostly an Irish Catholic force, it also welcomed into its ranks Germans, French, Italians, and escaped U.S. slaves. The twin mottos of the battalion were Eringo Brach, Ireland Forever, and Libertad por la República de Mexicana, Freedom for the Mexican Republic.
The St. Patrick's Battalion was founded by John Riley. Riley, a recent immigrant to the U.S., had joined the Army and found himself part of the force sent to provoke the Mexicans into war at the Rio Grande.
Irish immigrants were mistreated regularly in America, both for their ancestry and for their Catholicism. Disillusioned by discrimination from United States Army officials and realizing that he was participating in the first moves of a coming imperial war, Riley and several compatriots deserting the U.S. Army fled to the Mexicans, offering their services and warning of the coming invasion. Sure enough, it came. And by the Battle of Monterey, the St. Patrick's Battalion was a well-oiled artillery crew that wreaked havoc on the invading Americans, their former countrymen.
Though the St. Patrick's Battalion was primarily Irish deserters, it also included other people, disillusioned by discrimination and the fraudulent war. Germans, Poles, and even some escaped American slaves fought alongside the Mexican defenders. By the Battle of Churubusco, several Irishmen had been awarded the War Cross by the Mexican government for valorous service, but the forces of Santa Anna were crumbling. Pushed towards Mexico City, Santa Anna ordered a strong contingent of his men to hold the line at the convent in Churubusco. Among these men, the St. Patrick's Battalion.
As the U.S. troops pushed in and the highway reinforcements distracted by James Shields failed to arrive, the battalion fought tooth and nail within the convent to prevent it from falling. When the defenders ran out of ammo, one officer prepared a white flag. Patrick Dalton, one of the original deserters along John Riley, tore the white flag to pieces, ordering the men to fight with their bare hands if necessary.
A few dozen of the battalion retreated from the convent to the highway, into the clutches of James Shields. The rest of the Irishmen fought on in the convent against their former countrymen in brutal hand-to-hand combat, until eventually they were killed or captured. Shields had now turned John Riley and 84 other members of the St. Patrick's Battalion into prisoners of the U.S. Army, a sizable portion of the 800 prisoners he happily delivered to Winfield Scott.
Since Riley had deserted before the war officially started, he got off easy. He was punished to 50 lashes with a whip. Declaring that Riley was unfit to be whipped by an American, Colonel William Harney had him whipped by a Mexican mule driver. A letter D was burned into Riley's cheek to label him as a deserter.
The rest of the Irish deserters who had fought for Mexico were not as lucky. They were subject to hasty trials where they were denied lawyers and where transcripts of the trial were foregone. Although the Articles of War commanded that convicted deserters were to be executed by firing squad, the former members of the St. Patrick's Battalion were sentenced to hang. The United States wanted to make an example of the Irishmen.
50 men were executed by the United States Army in September of 1847. 16 were hanged simultaneously on September 10th, and 4 the following day. The remaining 30 were transported to Mexico City, where a makeshift mass scaffold was built. The men were brought out to a hill overlooking the ancient fortress of Chapultepec on September 13th, as James Shields and thousands of other soldiers stormed the castle. Shields' men were the very first to break into Mexico City. On General Winfield Scott's orders, his fellow Irishmen were to be hanged in full view of both armies whenever the battle concluded.
At 9:30 a.m., the U.S. deserters who had resisted American invasion and thrown in their lot with the Mexican army watched the battle rage. Their hands were tied behind their backs, and nooses were tied around their necks. According to legend, they watched as one of the teenage military cadets climbed the castle wall, wrapped himself in the Mexican flag, and threw himself to his death. The men cheered with pride as they watched the boy protect the Mexican flag from the Americans.
Colonel William Harney wanted the deserters to see Mexico fall. He waited for their cheers to die down. He watched the now unadorned flagpole above Chapultepec Castle. Slowly, an American flag rose along the pole, and when it reached its peak and caught the breeze, Harney gave the order, and 30 men were hanged together. Patrick Dalton's noose wasn't tight enough to break his neck, and instead he choked to death over the next half hour.
The United States Army not only covered up the executions for decades, but denied the very existence of the St. Patrick's Battalion, only admitting its cover-up when Congress demanded all records related to the battalion in 1915. They are rarely mentioned in America.
Every September across Mexico, the warriors of the battalion are memorialized and remembered as martyrs and heroes.
James Shields became a U.S. Senator, using his power to argue for continued American expansion and the importance of protecting slavery. He founded several towns in Minnesota, including Faribault, moved to California, and eventually opened a silver mine in Mexico, before fighting for the Union in the Civil War. He died in 1879. He is remembered as the only American to be elected senator of 3 different states. A statue commemorates him in the Minnesota Capitol and in the United States Capitol building.
Many of the challenges and complexities of American history rest in this tale at the heart of James Shields' life. Both American history and James Shields' story is even more complicated, bizarre, and worth learning more about, however. For the full story on James Shields' impact on the United States and Minnesota in particular, check out our deeper biography. Thank you for watching this episode of 1855.